All right, everyone, we're going to get going. I'm Sarah Dimmick. I am an assistant professor in the English department here at Harvard. And along with Robin Kelsey, who is over here, I co-organize the Environment Forum. So I encourage you to look at the Mahindra Center's webpage and see the other events that we have occurring over this semester and next. It's really an incredible lineup of speakers this year. I want to thank Steve Beal, Mary McKinnon, and the entire staff of the Mahindra Humanities Center for doing all of the organizing and work that brings tonight's event into being. The Mahindra Center is truly an incredible institution, and we're very, very lucky to have them on campus. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce Heather Hauser, the Modi C. Boatwright Regents Professor in American and English Literature at the University of Texas at Austin. I met Heather in the spring of 2019 when I was finishing a postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University. Heather was on campus to give a talk based on her manuscript that would eventually become her second book, Infowhelm. And I was both very excited to meet her and incredibly nervous. Ingenious and cutting-edge scholars can also be a little overbearing, occasionally brushing off people who are new to the field. But Heather came to my office and asked question after question about my work, offering reading recommendations and listing her tips for life on the tenure track. It was an act of generosity that I have never forgotten. I suspect tonight you will notice the same openness and curiosity as Heather discusses her research. Heather's first book, Eco-Sickness in Contemporary U.S. Fiction, Environment and Affect, was published by Columbia University Press in 2014. And her second book, Infowhelm, Environmental Art and Literature in an Age of Data, came out from Columbia in 2020. Beyond these award-accruing monographs, she is an incredibly prolific writer. Her articles appear in American literature, contemporary literature, public culture, modern fiction studies, environmental humanities, ASAP Journal, and other venues. Her public writing graces the pages of the Los Angeles Review of Books, LitHub, Public Books, and numerous other publications. She works across the fields of contemporary U.S. literature, the environmental humanities, the medical humanities, science studies, women's and gender studies, affect theory, and data visualization, to name just a few. This year, through a New Directions Fellowship from the Mellon Foundation, Heather is studying public health at Johns Hopkins University. This interdisciplinary study will contribute to her next book, Our Bodies, Our Climate, which reads stories of the environmental future in tandem with biological and social determinants of health to trace the myriad connections between climate change and reproductive health. When I think about the wave of books on motherhood written in relation to the climate crisis, from Elizabeth Rush's book, The Quickening, to Camille Dungy's Soil, the story of a Black mother's garden, to Peggy O'Donnell's Without Children, the long history of not being a mother, I am immensely glad that Heather Hauser is the one tackling this historically fraught and ever more crucial subject. Reproduction, population, and motherhood form a third rail within environmental thought. They are also the kinds of topics that can break apart friendships or collectives if not handled with care. We need scholarship as attentive and as responsible as Heather's as these conversations continue to unfold. Heather, we're so grateful that you're here with us tonight to share your work. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. Now I'm flashing back to that time in your office and very grateful that that relationship is enduring here in this forum and in others. And I hope to live up to that introduction, both tonight and with the project writ large. And I did want to thank Sarah for inviting me here to the Mahindra Center, and also Robin and Steve Beal for amplifying that invitation, I guess, and very much to thank Mary McKinnon for making everything happen very smoothly on my visit thus far. I do have here, this is the title of my talk, Rethinking Reproduction and Climate Crisis. I do have, for those who want to follow along in your own devices, accessibility copies to the slides and also to the talk, if that's a better way to engage. So this is a very personal topic for kind of everyone. But last October, I got this email in my inbox from someone whose name I recognized, but couldn't quite place it. And then I opened it, and her name is Claire McInerney. And she is was a journalist for the local public radio station in Austin, where I live. And she was now working on an episode of a podcast called Terrible Thanks for Asking. I don't know if folks listen to this, but it was about people deciding whether to have children. And the email quickly got very personal. This person I've never met. She wanted to record a conversation about her, quote, decision with a partner on whether to have kids, which also kind of included me in that question. And she continued, one of the anxieties I feel when it comes to this subject is around what the world will look like for future generations when it comes to climate change. And she is what I call in this project a white woman wondering. That is a term I use to capture a lot of cultural production around the question of reproductive decision making that's tended to be dominated by white women, though it's not exclusively their territory. And they're thinking about this really under the pressure, under the weight of the now. And Claire wonders because of climate change in particular. And so, of course, the catalog of actually occurring climate impacts is getting longer and longer. And certainly climate disasters tend to fill headlines. But as Rob Nixon has taught us, there are far more slow going and far more intimate concerns around climate impacts. And reproduction is certainly one of those. Sex, reproduction, family making are really falling in the climate crosshairs today. And so Claire's wondering is evidence of this, as are debates from a lot of climate pundits about whether to kid or not to kid, which is the title of a documentary. These are just some of the sort of back and forth headlines on this question. There's also a lot of polling that's starting to incorporate this. And there's, in fact, a project by Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, who is doing a lot of empirical studies around this question as well. So this polling shows that environmental and climate threats, while not at the top of the polling of the considerations, is certainly making the list and increasingly influencing reproductive intentions. So this intersection of reproduction and climate is the topic of my talk today and of the project that Sarah mentioned, which for today has the title, Our Bodies, Our Climate, Rethinking Reproduction and Family in the 21st Century. And now I'm dedicated to this issue, this project, but I feel like a fool for entering into it as for reasons that Sarah mentioned. Climate crisis and reproduction are kind of two of the hottest of hot button issues right now. Emotions flare up. And when you combine them, you're really asking for trouble. But fortunately, I think I'm not the only one on this errand. You mentioned the quickening. There are a number of texts that are really thinking about this question. And my book is entering this terrain that, while it's by no means new, is certainly being looked at anew in the 2020s. So I'm going to walk part of this terrain and my investigations of it tonight, and I'll just briefly give an outline of where I'm heading. So I'll survey the phenomena that really arise at the nexus of reproduction and climate that go beyond that question of should I not have a child, And from one perspective, you can think of these as like the facts of the matter, but they're highly contentious in themselves as well. I'll then give a brief, stay here. I'll give a brief overview of the project that I'm embarking on, Our Bodies, Our Climate. And my book does not at all aim to resolve that question to kid or not to kid. It instead details the tensions that arise at this nexus, and I'll talk a bit about that in a section of my talk. And then that overview leads to a section I'm calling Consenting to a Future. And this delves into issues around consent and force, pessimism and optimism, growth and restraint, extinction and continuance, and then scale, the issue of being a geophysical force as well as a reproducing body. And I will spare you all going into all of those tonight, but I will touch on some of them. And I really enter these tensions through ethical angles on that question, how many children should you have, especially if you live in a high income country. So that's what's motivating those debates in those headlines. Positions on antinatalism, the small family ethic, and what Harriet Washington terms medical apartheid are sort of my way into that question, though I'll only take up some of those tonight as well. And I propose that we dwell with these tensions to avoid some of the reactionary responses and really to trace, to see what can easily get overlooked when we approach this nexus from one disciplinary or one even more polemical position. And it's undoubtedly one of the most intimate and consequential decisions people face. So it's not surprising that it gets a lot of reactionary responses, but dwelling with a philosophical as well as affective and environmental quandary surrounding how many unsettles the oppositions that can calcify in both the environmental and the reproductive rights movements. And it also reminds us how climate crisis really does pass through embodied identities in ways that and also ramify far beyond the individual. So I'll start by not starting and taking a sip of water, but I'll start by talking about this reproduction climate nexus. So when I tell people I'm investigating this, it does readily go to that question of, is it okay to have a child? That question that appears in the headline. That's a 2020 article in the London Review of Books. And it's really not surprising. There's plenty of clickbait and really more substantial writing around this question, grabbing attention with like, are kids bad for the planet? They're gonna save the planet except for the babies. That's the National Review. And this perspective has two prongs to it, really. There's one prong that's responding to the environmental impacts of reproduction. So given that a new person consumes land, food, water, goods, energy, and all of that has its greenhouse gas emissions attached to it, should you curtail your individual fertility to mitigate climate change? So that's the motivating question behind that this prong of child-free for climate. And some scientific research does encourage reducing populations as a mitigation and adaptation strategy. This is where the history of population control and its racist, sexist, and colonialist agendas certainly enter the equation, but sometimes don't get talked about very explicitly. That's something I do take up very explicitly in several parts of the book and a bit tonight. Nonetheless, scientists often are supporting women's education and family planning programs focused on gender justice as a pathway to fertility rate decline or stabilization. Other studies and climate solution portfolios, such as Project Drawdown, are urging the same. But the research is certainly equivocal, and others are less convinced that this is anything that should be part of climate considerations. This isn't only due to the history of population control, though that often does arise in the discourse. It's also because it can take too long to actually change fertility patterns in any significant way. And then there's the whole question of, fertility rates are already on the decline, so why do we need an intervention there? So this is certainly a very unsettled aspect of the field, but it's something that people are increasingly giving attention to. So if this prong of child-free or only one, child-free or fewer, people often say, if this prong attends to how the possible child will damage the world, the second prong really thinks about how the world will damage the child. And I go into this later in my remarks, so I won't spend time on that now. And so this has really gone viral, but it's by no means the only aspect of what I'm calling the reproduction climate nexus. So I'm using this phrase, I make up phrases, I discard them. We'll see how long this one lasts. But this refers to all the factors, be they biological, ethical, political, affective, representational, all of them that really arise or obtain when people approach fertility and family in light of climate crisis. And then in turn, when environmental changes impinge on reproductive intentions. So another startling, if controversial phenomenon at this nexus concerns climate effects on reproductive biology. So you might have heard conversations around this book. I'm not even going to read the title. It would make me go over time, but Countdown from 2021. So Shanna Swan and collaborators, they build on this 2017 meta-analysis of sperm count studies. And this really mainstreamed, that study and now this book, mainstreamed the idea that endocrine disruptors are diminishing sperm quality and quantity. And this, of course, is then affecting male fertility in humans and other animals. And other research is pointing to a host of impacts on pregnancy and birth. So these include air pollution, reducing women's fertility, or wildfire smoke leading to lower birth rate and preterm births, and extreme heat straining fetuses and increasing risk of stillbirth. So it's not surprising that if you've heard about this, it might be from like dried up testes or shrinking penises. Like this gets a lot of attention and tends to overshadow these sorts of concerns about what happens to pregnant women and fetuses. And all of this and more really points to the intricacy of that reproductive and climate nexus beyond that. If not simple, it's still very complex matter of individually choosing whether to bear children. So I think crucially, climate disruptions to reproductive health make visible and amplify persistent patterns of gender, class, and racial inequity and violence, as some other studies are really investigating, like what happens in the wake of or during a climate disaster to women, pregnant people, children. And here's another set of studies about reproductive health during the hurricanes Katrina and Harvey. So the first chapter of Our Bodies, Our Climate is tracing these tangles of this nexus, dealing with climate pressures on gender, equity, fertility, family making, and reproductive health. And that's something that the work I'm doing on this New Directions Fellowship is really informing. So I've not written that because I'm trying to learn from my public health professors. I'm a student. It's amusing. Happy to talk about that. But the rest of the book builds on this foundation. So I am an environmental humanist. I've mostly written about literature and visual culture. And that is going to be a part of this book and a bit of this talk. But I'm stepping out of that training quite a bit, even more than I have in the past, But I'm certainly using it because I want to understand the frameworks guiding or thwarting climate action. And I think, and how in turn, like culture, aesthetics, and identity shape those frameworks. And for me, reproduction is one way into that, or one of those bigger issues that we're starting to talk about, but it's obviously very fraught and hard to do. So through a reproductive justice lens in particular, I'm looking at some of these questions. Who gets to choose childbearing, especially given racism, poverty, disability, inadequate social supports, and heteropatriarchal parenting? When reproduction enters climate action, does it always carry that taint of reproduction, harmful population control? And then what artistic and activist interventions really respond both to climate pressures and to values underpinning nuclear family to think about reproductive futures? So as I said, I try to get purchase on these questions without polemic, though I probably don't succeed always. And I draw on my background in cultural analysis and environmental and health humanities that lay bare these tensions. These are overlapping with the one from the chapter I'll talk about today, but sort of more broadly, including things like scarcity and abundance, freedom or choice and restraint, certainty and wondering. And these aren't simple binaries. So in fact, one of the book's arguments is that this nexus really scrambles their easy opposition. And this understanding gives insight, I think, into the historically coincident environmental and reproductive rights movements and some of the impasses of climate action now. Now, since the start of this project, I've really wanted it to reach a wider readership. So that's another new thing I'm pursuing. This isn't really a scholarly monograph. It has a general audience in mind, and I'm hoping to wrest reproduction and climate out of choice logics and individualism without merely saying like, oh, it's the system, stupid. It can be like this alternative between individualism and, oh, it's the system. And I'm trying to think about what that binary is through some of these tensions I have up here. And I think looking at these and others acknowledges the affective and ethical force of these issues and opens on how art and media really do shape them. It tugs at the seams of procreation as a default without condemning childbearing, and stitches together ideas of family under climate crisis. And I really hope this like sort of more general readership might have new purchase on how climate crisis intersects with identity in ways that are consequential for bodies, families, communities, and the planet. Now, I do have an academic audience in mind, some of you, all of you maybe. So the book is also making the case for reproductive climate study as a kind of field or subfield, this emergent area of art and journalism and science and the humanities. And in addition to all the people I've cited, I won't read these, but these are some of the people I'm in dialogue with who are artists on the one side and scholars on the other side. And this nexus, I think, in addition to inviting all these voices and more, it really invites even more robust interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary engagement. So these are just some of the many fields that I think have to be brought to bear to really think about reproductive climate study out of isolation. And so tonight, I will by no means try to compass all this, but I am going to give a taste of a chapter that's really focusing on issues around harm, consent, extinction, and continuance through procreation. And I'm going to be a bit of a hypocrite because while I say, and it's true, that this is about more than choosing how many children to have, it is something that I'm going to be focusing on in the remainder of my time. So I'm not a parent. So writing about this means I talk about myself more than I'm used to. Although I'm also talking about myself in another project in ways I'm also uncomfortable with. It seems like I'm drawn to discomfort is a way to describe my research trajectory or writing trajectory. And as a kid, I went from like playing with dolls to just really feeling strongly I did not want to be a mother. And it happened in pretty short order. But I haven't talked about this with anyone except for close friends until now, and with this book. And for the first time, like I'm really explicitly seeing how my personal life informs my scholarship. And so the project does include some personal writing. And I'm finding that even more, like if you're a professor, if you're a scholar, if you're a writer, like you're voraciously like just surveying the field everywhere you go, and things are suddenly striking you as relevant, even when you want to be turned off, right? We know this, but it's becoming even more intense, I feel, with this project. So, for example, recently, I finally got around to watching Beef, the Netflix series. I just watched it a couple months ago. And if you haven't seen it, it's good, but you know, it's intense. So that's directed by Lee Sung-jin, and Ali Wong's character, this is the title of this section. Ali Wong's character, Amy, is explaining, there's a scene in episode 7. She's explaining her decision to bear a child to her therapist. And now we can debate whether she's being disingenuous in this scene, but it doesn't change my purposes here. So she says, "For so long, I was worried about passing on all my negative traits. I really thought I was doing the world a favor by not reproducing. But then I met George, and I thought maybe, just maybe, if we could take the best parts of him and the salvageable parts of me, that we could make something nice. And we did. Junie's perfect." So this moment struck me partially because it's so unrelatable, as our students would say. So I actually feel I take solace in the idea that it all ends with me, that neither my best parts nor salvageable parts will continue in another person. And I realized in this moment, watching this scene, like, how foreign my attitude is to most people, as maybe Amy's was to me, listening to that confession. And as we saw earlier in the polls, people adduce a lot of reasons behind their reproductive intentions, but desire for non-continuance is really one of them. Although maybe no desire for children might include that sentiment. So solace in the idea it all ends with me feels aberrant in a society, especially sort of drawn to evolutionary logics and to the myth of the maternal instinct, which has been talked about as a myth quite a bit recently. So one way to look at this sentiment is that it's anti-natalist. And in fertility studies, this means simply policies and programs that are either explicitly or implicitly reducing fertility. As a philosophical position, though, it has aspects that make accepting this label hard for me and for most people. So the fundamental idea is that procreation is not permissible because it's morally wrong. Antinatalism has actually received quite a bit of attention, thanks to True Detective, another TV show. The creator of that show cited David Benatar, who's sort of the father, though I think he'd hate that term, of antinatalism, at least its modern form. He was cited as an inspiration for the season 1's main character. And then there was this 2017 profile of Benatar, the antinatalist, in the New Yorker and some other articles that followed. In his 2015 book, Benatar actually enters a debate with an antinatalist, David Wasserman. And Benatar argues in this book, quote, "In creating a child, one creates the basic condition for all the terrible things that will or could befall it. One creates the vulnerability to all other harms, from the mildest to the most unspeakable horrors. While not everybody suffers the worst fates, nobody escapes serious harm entirely. The surest way to prevent the awful things that will happen to one's child is not to have that child. And here Benatar is really talking about family formation, but he soon offers a verdict on the human species. So this stronger form, it would be better if there were no more humans. It would be better if humans became extinct, at least if extinction were brought about by not creating new members of the species. And even though ethical antinatalism isn't fundamentally a response to climate, you can see how it translates into that space. So scholars such as Patricia McCormack here with the 2020 book, and this group, the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, whose founder was also recently, I think fairly recently, profiled in the New York Times, they insist that you pronounce their name vehement, so I'll call them that moving forward. But they envision a world without humanity in which other than human species and ecosystems can thrive. So these and like-minded folks, I guess, seem deeply pessimistic, but I follow Mark Schmidt, a critic, in differentiating them from absolute pessimists who are entirely anti-life, human or otherwise. So McCormack and Vehement don't espouse pure negation. I actually think of their pessimism as being sort of oriented toward an optimism for the planet that requires a graceful, in McCormack's phrasing, bowing out of humanity. And they argue not having children is a way to do this. And so the reaction, I think, can easily be like, these are depressive filmmakers, these are rogue philosophers, fringe philosophers and activists. It's not really something to take seriously. But I do think there are expressions of this idea, including this from poet Ambalila Hemsel, who's a parent. Whether that matters or not is up to you. But she, in this poem, Passport, she writes, the speaker says, I wished you into this world, so I cannot say I didn't wish this world upon you. Its lopsided wing beats, its horrors. So, central really to the antinatalist argument and implicit in this poem is the quality of the child's experience and their inability to consent to that experience. And I don't know if you were angsty teenagers. I wasn't too bad, but I certainly could be petulant. And my poor, overextended single mom had to deal with me in those moments. She got all those feelings. And I don't remember the trigger, but I remember this moment driving with her, and I just barked out, well, I didn't ask to be born anyway. I don't know how many people, I'm tempted to say show of hands, but it might be a lot of us who have said that. And it really seemed profound at the time. I thought I was like a little budding philosopher. And it wasn't because, many of us have had that thought, but maybe that is exactly why it was. And I think it kind of was, because how do we reckon with the impossibility of extracting consent for life from the unborn if the non-existent can't agree to face the trials of existence as well as its joys? How should potential parents weigh procreation ethically? So law scholar Sienna Schifrin is actually disavows the term antinatalist, but some of her ideas have fed into to that line of thinking. And she offers up or takes up these questions and the meaning of harm. So I think parental harm can evoke things like abuse or neglect or not providing adequate shelter or food, humiliation, these sorts of things. It might even include in some people's minds, like not providing all the material supports you can afford, like college tuition or study abroad or whatever it might be. And Schifrin's definition does include neglect and harm, but it's really even more expansive. So she writes, harm involves the imposition of a state or condition that directly or indirectly obstructs, prevents, frustrates, or undoes an agent's cognizant interaction with her circumstances and her efforts to fashion a life within them that is distinctively and authentically hers. So because no one has complete agency over what will happen to them, life is filled with harm in this argument. So Benatar and Schifrin offer examples from the smallest, like you have to go to the bathroom, but you don't have access to one, so you have to hold it, to obviously much more consequential, significant harms of poverty or racism, loss, and illness. So if discomfort is the default of existence and there's a chance of even more extreme pain, they argue we should receive consent before subjecting someone to those conditions. And that's impossible, they say. So procreation is an intrinsically and not just epistemically morally hard case that ineliminably, hard to say, involves serious moral hazards. And I honestly, I can't rehearse some of the philosophical principles underpinning this, but my interest is really not in attacking the philosophical merits of these claims so much as thinking about how they necessarily pervert the idea of choice that's so prominent in reproductive rights and environmental discourse to some extent. So the parent-to-be's choice twists into force from the perspective of the person to be in these arguments. And this contortion of choice differs from the reproductive justice critiques of choice, which are much more grounded. They say it's erroneous because it does disregard those systemic factors that make free choice impossible for everyone, but also for particular people subject to racism, poverty, abuse, incarceration, trauma, these sorts of, and really racist, discriminatory, educational, economic, and healthcare systems. So there are critiques of choice out there for sure, but my point is that the anti-natalist, sort of the way choice and consent get twisted in that is quite different and often they're not looked at together. So I think wishing the world on someone should weigh heavy. And I do think, parents think about that quite a bit. And lack of consent and risk of harm increase that load and encourage restraint in these arguments, not retreat into choice logics. And of course, then this enters climate crisis because that intensifies or creates a range of possible harms for a future person will face. And here's where the optimism, pessimism, one of the places optimism and pessimism certainly come in, because how you feel about the stakes of reproducing amid climate crisis has a lot to do about whether you think you have a pessimistic or optimistic perspective on what's to come. Many people anticipate improvement, and I've talked to friends about this. These are hard conversations too, but anticipate joy and possibility amidst all that. And it will counterbalance whatever's to come for their particular child. But many don't see it that way. They see millions of people and other beings injured or losing their lifeways, homes, and even facing death, and anticipate many more will face those harms in the future, given the trajectory we are on with climate action. So I think without realizing it, those foregoing reproduction out of consideration for their child's experiences of climate crisis, that one prong of child-free or fewer for the climate, are advancing at least an aspect of the antinatalist position, even if they wouldn't embrace it wholeheartedly. And even Wasserman, who argues against antinatalism, insists that reproduction shouldn't be a default, but the result of a deliberative process that weighs the totality of the child's future, as well as sort of the experiential and financial and other impacts on a parent and their community. So just to take up the next part of my talk, sort of a subset of the consenting to a future. Obviously, human extinction would result from wholesale adoption of this sentiment, this philosophy, and Vehement makes this explicit and really celebrates it. And we've seen a lot of novels and films thinking about this, if not from the voluntary extinction perspective, things like The Children of Men, a fertility crisis where the result would be human extinction, but even things like WALL-E, like it's not human it's like human extinction to a point, right? Because they're out there and they come back, and World Without Us text, sort of post-humanist text. So this idea is like voluntary extinction possibility might not be so popular, but thinking about human extinction is certainly out there. But I think these largely thought experiments, since even someone like Benatar is like, this is not going to happen on a large scale. But these thought experiments or entertaining reflections, in the case of maybe Wally, resonate differently in some ears. And this can get really drops out of the conversation, at least in my experience. So how might extinction sound to those who have faced threats of extinction? For whom it might, probably ridiculous, it all ends with me, isn't whimsy or philosophy, but a very real possibility and not a willed one. So I think we cannot think about whether it is wrong to reproduce, which is the titular question of Benatar and Wasserman's book. We cannot think about whether an optimism of the planet requires humans to will their extinction without reflecting on how patriarchal white supremacy has created those regimes of reproductive control. And I don't think we can face the end of babies without accounting for who that control targets. And especially how genocide and fears of it have shadowed, marginalized, mostly women's fertility here in the US, but also globally. So I go into this in much more depth in my book, but I'm checking the time. I think I'm okay. I talk about in the project and expand on how for Black Americans, reproduction grates on the idea of human extinction in particularly painful and complex ways. So, and there's certainly like Harriet Washington's and Dorothy Roberts and many other scholars and journalists study of really population control is one angle on that I address. But also looking at, through historian Jennifer Nelson's work, looking at the debates within the Black and Puerto Rican nationalist movements of the 60s and 70s, a really strong debate about whether contraception, embracing and advocating for more contraception and abortion access amounted to, in their language, like race suicide or facilitating the community's own genocide. So this is, I wanted to focus on this because I think, population control gets a lot of attention, and this is certainly related to that, forced sterilization. They're responding to that, but that this debate was very much happening within the movement, often between male leaders of the movements and Black and women of color feminists. So without denying the reality of forced sterilization and the criminalization of pregnancy for Black women, the feminists in the movement were really advocating again, or rejecting this equation of contraception and abortion with race suicide or sort of willed facilitated genocide. And I think also I talk about, and I'm attentive to how genocide and extinction have specific resonance for indigenous populations in the US, and not only in the colonial and expansionist period, but well into the 20th century. So the native birth rate actually fell precipitously in the 20th century. And scholar Marie Ralston Lewis, who's Cherokee, argues that coerced and forced fertility control, quote, was a systemic program aimed at reducing the native population or genocide. And she's not alone in this view. And there's actually been a lot more research, even urged by indigenous doctors and others to get the US itself to do some accounting for this. So the GAO, their numbers were contested because they seemed too low, but did a study and was really looking at how contraception and abortion, sterilization were used as biomedical tools to reduce native populations. That certainly reaches back to white settlement. But even going into, for example, the 1970s, I think it was within 3 years, 25 and 50% of Native women in the US were sterilized and had abortions. That's not all coerced or forced, but it's an incredibly high number that then researchers are sort of like reconstructing some of the circumstances for that and just individuals sharing their experiences of that. So if for Schifrin, the locus of consent for family making and thereby continuing the species is the future child, For Black and Indigenous groups, the locus for consent lies in these circumstances, lies in the bodies of girls and women and other pregnant people. Forced manipulation of Indigenous fertility is a reminder that, as Michelle Murphy Meti writes, control of population is bound to the material horror of genocide, apartheids, sexual violence, and colonialism. Each is animated by designations of life as expendable. So I think this idea of expendability, really, it all ends with me sort of shades into this idea really readily and in a way that doesn't always get attended to. And while no one should be expected to reproduce, to continue their race or language or culture, or be forced to do so, the idea of species-level extinction that motivates vehement can just look like abetting this centuries-long process of forced extinction from the perspective of other groups. Procreation, on the other hand, can be this maybe decolonial act of survival in defiance of extinction. And I always have to put, not always, but often my literary hat on. So I wanted to talk about a book that is maybe familiar to many of you. Louise Erdrich's 2017 speculative novel, Future Home of the Living God, really imagines this entanglement of extinction and continuance with reproductive control. So it imagines a climate-altered world in which a biological apocalypse is unraveling. So like megafauna are sort of running through suburban streets in Minneapolis, in the suburbs of Minneapolis. You have bacteria and viruses running amok. No one quite knows why. It's as if evolution is running in reverse. And women, crucially, are losing their fertility, although there are some rare births. But some of those births are kind of genetically ambiguous. They're not fully human, it seems. And then there are some so-called originals that are genetically human babies, and they're rarer still and precious to the state. So the protagonist, Cedar Songmaker, is mixed race Ojibwe. I won't go into the whole, there's a lot of stuff going on in this novel. But she is pregnant and faces the presumptive choice of entering a hospital to receive good care, so-called good care, to deliver her child, or go on the lam and risk involuntary incarceration. So in this story world, fertility controls are very much set off or at least exacerbated by climate crisis. And while a fugitive, Cedar receives help from the fetus's father, Phil. He enjoins her to consider the value of her precious cargo. So you have a treasure, Cedar, if our baby is normal. We would be in charge of things, rich, super rich. We'd be safe. If we somehow worked out genetically, I mean, to have a normal child, the sky's the limit for us. And the novel, I think, makes it clear that Phil's whiteness is really contributing to his naive exuberance about what their prospects might be. His use of normal here is really emphasizing that eugenic history. And Cedar, however, is freshly attuned to the colonialism and dispossession Phil excludes from their reproductive future. So the novel's ending is rather ambiguous and emphasizes that reproduction and climate nexus via an image of whiteness anticipated in this scene with Phil. So Cedar is imprisoned. I won't, no spoilers, but the baby, well, this is a spoiler. Close your ears, leave the room. The baby she birthed has been taken from her, and she's become a vessel essentially for, or potential vessel for forced pregnancy to repopulate the nation potentially. So Cedar recalls at the very end of the novel, the last snow she tasted on her tongue before basically winters disappeared from Minnesota. And she's surrounded by this blizzard, and thinking whiteness fills the air and whiteness is all there is. So here whiteness becomes this harbinger for a climate return to its prior seasonality. Nod to Sarah's project on seasonality. But it is also a symbol of the reproductive control that renders Cedar's fertility state property. And at the same time this is happening, she's this procreative prisoner. The novel also envisions, though, that the panic of de-evolution could aid the land back movement. So while people are fleeing, white people are fleeing, this makes re-inhabitation of ancestral Ojibwe lands possible, easier. And this opportunism reflects a point that the tribal leader, Eddie, makes to Cedar early in the novel. So they're discussing this evolutionary fertility crisis. And he says, Indians have been adapting since before 1492, so I guess we'll keep adapting. But the world is going to pieces. Like, she insists on the exceptionality of the present. It is always going to pieces. So you hear this idea here of, like, we have long been apocalyptic. That is a lot of Indigenous and Black scholars and artists' response to the Anthropocene concept. But when Erdrich couples this narrative about Homo sapiens' possible extinction with one about land back, I think she not only predicates the latter on the former, she also evokes the centuries-long damages of colonialism that results in reproductive violence and also a planet in crisis. And so I want to sort of go back to my starting point of how thinking about antinatalism. I'm not surveying this Indigenous or Black fertility control to delegitimate antinatalism, but to highlight that conversation sort of proceeds on one track, one understanding of what consent and force means, and there's silence around what extinction means to specific communities, specific people. Consent in Erdrich's novel doesn't translate into Schifrin's and Benatar's philosophies, and reproductive pessimism might equate to optimism for the planet for vehement, but it can equate to acquiescence to erasure in another calculus. So I'm going to wrap up by, this is a lot, and I think my point in saying that is a lot of people aren't going to compass all this terrain, like in their fertility decisions. Like, I think some people do, but most people will not, or maybe some of these issues and not others. But I think when we zoom out from individual family formation, we do need to take this all in and more, and not to prescribe whether it's okay to have a child or even only one, but to really account for the seismic ground on which we're stepping, basically, when climate and reproduction intersect. So we're not only calculating a GHG emissions number that drives climate anomalies and catastrophic impacts. We're calculating what it means to continue, how consent balances out force, what it means to be pessimistic about humanity or optimistic for the planet, and how that equation factors into the violences of colonialism and medical apartheid. So thank you very much, and look forward to the conversation.
I have about 20 questions for you, but I'm going to open the floor and invite questions from our audience. I believe we have a microphone over there. Mary has the mic. So when you ask your question, please do speak into the microphone. It will get picked up then on the recording.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I had a question about, so wishing the world onto a child. I can see why that would be a very fraught, morally difficult decision, and that could be the case for a range of reasons. It could be because you're in poverty or you're in a country where there's recurrent civil wars. Could you say a little bit more about what's specific with climate in particular, and what sorts of, when we think about optimism and pessimism, is there a distinctive kind of optimism and pessimism that comes up with that issue? Or is it just exacerbating for people a dilemma that many others have already had to face for different reasons?
Yeah, I think it is the latter. I mean, I think also this childfree for climate is very much a wealthy, high income conversation, country discourse. I welcome people to point me to where it's happening in other places, but that's really where I've seen it. And so I think it's really accounting for things that have been there, right? In many respects of like, there is always potential conflict, death, poverty, all sorts of traumas, abuse that could happen to a child. But I think part of it is the lack of control people feel. You feel a lack, right? A lack of control people feel, a lot of uncertainty and sort of I'm thinking now that I'm taking public health, even though I can't make graphs, though I wrote a book about them somewhat. Like I think in terms of these graphs, they just pop into my head, just like how things are moving in a direction that seems out of anyone's control. So I don't think it's by no means new, but I think the populations that are thinking about it are really faced in or put into this position of lack of control and uncertainty about and impotence about where things might be heading. It's interesting in my public health courses, this came up recently that fertility rates do not decline in conditions of genocide or extreme conflict. Like that's not something, and because it made me think about this question, and made, the context specificity of where this might be arising clearer to me, hoping our class goes in my climate change direction. But that point about places like Cambodia that have experienced genocide or extreme conflict and war, it doesn't reduce the fertility rate. So, the genocide question, there are reasons we can think behind that, but war itself, you would think might be a curb, but it hasn't been in those contexts.
Thank you for the talk so far. How do you think adoption plays into this conversation?
Yeah. And that is one of the, it's going to be a part of the project. I haven't figured out exactly where it's going to fit in. I actually have a woman in my writing group is an adopted person. And we talk about it quite a bit when I share parts of this project, because it's strangely it'll get mentioned. For example, Bill, I spared you all the talk on the part of the talk on small family ethics, but Bill McKibben wrote this book called Maybe One. And I want to say it came out in 1997. So kind of predates a lot of the flurry of discourse around this now. But adoption hardly figures in that book. It is often something that gets skirted. And I do think it's a lot of people's response, if not action, right? That comes up as a possibility, but I think people really, and that's why I'm interested in the idea of continuance and what it means for people, because a lot, I think, of people who want to be parents want a biological child. And so that idea of continuance, I think, is really, it's a really strong pressure against what might seem like an obvious, if by no means smooth and easy, and there are all sorts of issues with adoption, people experience, but it's something that I'll certainly enter through Erdrick's novel, because the protagonist is an adopted child, and she was adopted into a white family. So it introduces all of the issues around. It's very complex, no spoilers. I won't tell you what goes on with that part of the plot, but it's certainly thinking about the question of adoption less, I think, from the climate crisis angle of things and more from the history of adoption of Indigenous children in the US. So it might be one way I enter it, but I also welcome more references on this, but it doesn't seem to come up in the conversation much. So I think continuance is one of the ways that I'm going to be thinking about that.
Thank you for the talk, Heather. It was
really fascinating to sort of see you cover so much ground as you look into this question. I was actually a little surprised by some of the charts you showed early on, in which climate change is actually quite low in people's reasons for not having children. And yet, even in the Washington Post, like this weekend, there was another article, I think by a young woman in her 20s who was saying, well, I'm not going to have children. And it's not, and address sort of this war instability issue by saying that it's existential. And that's why she was taking that tack. So I was wondering, is there in fact a gap between, say, people's asserted reasons why they're not having children and the kind of attention, right, given specifically to the choice that's made around climate? And obviously, I know that it's sort of hard to parse some of this, but just speculating, is it, does it become entwined with a kind of like these sort of ethical questions or kind of class questions or race questions that makes it a more appealing kind of, more appealing fodder for publication in social media?
Right. Yeah. Well, one thing I'm also learning in my public health, I'm like a kid who just went to college and comes back home and is like, I took this psych class and now I know about this. So forgive me, I'm a little geeky and whatever. But is the like fertility intentions and actions, there's a very big gap there. And I feel like that speaks to also just like the matrix. I know now I'm saying matrix and not nexus, but the like matrix of things that people think about when they have children, I think are really hard to parse even themselves. Like economic pressures are often more obvious to people. It's often one of the first things that'll come up, like, can I afford to have a child if I want to? Or, is that a reason I shouldn't have more? So that I think can be more tangible, but sort of a milieu, like a personal, psychological or existential mess of things that someone might be considering, I think can be harder to parse. And I'm thinking of Jenny Offel's novel, Weather, in which she does have a child. So it's not about whether she should or should not, but thinking about now the world that she and the child move through, where it's very easily moves from like the day-to-day parenting stuff of like getting your kids somewhere or feeding your son or whatever. And then like thinking, hearing headlines or hearing the podcast philosopher, she's a philosopher, I think, that she works for, like hearing all of her very dire, pessimistic predictions. And it all just becomes like a slurry or a stew of things that it might be hard to parse out, like, well, what am I thinking about that has to do with the world the child will live in versus like, what is my just day-to-day experience of parenting going to be like? And I, some people who are parents who are writing about that are certainly, and I talked to Larson about this the other morning, like just thinking about how they are, just as right now, people are thinking about how to broach the issue of the Israel-Hamas war with young children. Like, how am I going to talk about that with my child? So I think that is not like, do I bring a kid because the person already exists, but it's all very like day-to-day parenting, like suddenly turns into this really existential as well as ethical, like parenting question. So I also like the polling's weird, and I can't speak to, how those studies were done, but I think the way the questions can be phrased can certainly influence that. But we shall see if it keeps rising, and certainly young people talk about it a ton. Like my generation didn't really talk about this when we were in our 20s so much, but my students in their 20s talk about it all the time. So it's just, we'll see.
Thank you very much. You covered so much territory in that talk. At the beginning, and then also in answering the first question, you said this has been mainly a conversation in high-income countries. So I wondered if you could expand a little on that, your thoughts about it, and not just the fact that it's a conversation in high-income countries, but is it the same conversation in Europe as it is in this country, or Japan as it is in this country, or even in China, which just recently modified its one-child policy? So that's one question. And the other was, within countries, the difference, if you want to talk about responsibility for the climate issue, is greatly divided too. People who have a fair amount of money and fly 5 or 6 times a year just have much more responsibility, if you want to call it that, than people who drive a car to work 10 or 20 miles a day. The top 1% of the world's population has put twice as much CO2 into the atmosphere as the poorest half of the world. Mm-hmm. So how does all this income level play into this conversation? I don't have an answer to it, but it seems to me it's got to be a pretty significant part of the conversation at one point or another.
It is, yeah. And I'll come back to the variation across countries. So the part I cut once my talk was clearly going to be an hour and a half long, the small family ethic group, I would group together maybe several parties there, but do talk about that more explicitly. That is that upper middle class, certainly 1%ers need to, if you think you have a responsibility to contribute to the mitigation of climate change, you should be considering this, because, and especially because greater contributions, the greater wealth you have, that almost always you're going to pass on to your children, that those levels of consumption or emission, depending on how technology changes maybe. But so that is a big part of the conversation, that this is really, and one of the reasons it happens a lot in high income countries is that they're the biggest contributors, and then a certain percentage of countries are the ones who are contributing the most to climate change. A lot of people are uncomfortable though with these equations, I guess you could say. Like, a lot of people just reject this, like that this is not the way to think about climate action. Like, some people want to put it in a portfolio. I call it sort of a portfolio. All hands on deck is one way a lot of people will think about it. Like, this is not the answer, but nor is go buy an electric car the answer, nor is like total solar generation the answer. Like, we need everything, and let's put this in the mix, or at least make it part of the conversation. And that is, though, the burden is on, in these people's arguments, on mostly upper middle class and then wealthier people. So it is a big part of the conversation, and people will actually do equations around these things and think about how the contributions and the, call it the legacy. So I think a lot of these studies, it will think of like your children and then maybe 1 or 2 generations after you. Some people, reject that. We should think of, I forget what it's called, but there's like a philosophical principle behind this that's just like, no, that's not how we think about ethical burdens. They don't carry across generations in that way. But yes, sorry, now I'm rambling. It is focused more on the wealthier parts of the wealthiest countries. As for variations across countries, I'll plead a bit of ignorance around that, except that I know there's a robust discourse in Western Europe, and like in France, there have been books and quite a few, like sort of the kinds of headlines we find here. And I know that more because I can read French and speak French. So there might be more in Germany. Certainly this conversation is happening. Japan's interesting because its fertility is so low that and a lot of East Asian countries like Korea, very, very low. Singapore, like they have pronatal. Some of those countries had failed pronatalist programs because they're so worried about so like sort of the climate question. I don't know, because I don't actually know, but I would hypothesize that like the climate question, it's maybe out there for certain people, but sort of as a public discourse might get lost in the like, our fertility rate is 1, that's like not seen before in the history of humanity. That's a bit much, but like it's a very staggering number that they tend to be focused on. China, I'm not sure how the climate question is that, I mean, it's the case, like everyone talks about the one child policy. So it's sort of like and how it's changed now, but fertility actually hasn't changed since that change sort of fast or happened too recently to really know the impacts, but it's not changing at the moment. So yeah, that's an area I should look into. I'm mostly focusing on the US just out of controlling the expansion of this project, and that's the area I've worked in. But I'm certainly interested and want to talk, hoping a lot of the public health classes and just research I'm looking at is actually for other countries, not the US. So hoping I will learn through that process.
Thank you, Heather. I don't blame you for focusing mostly on the U.S., even though the problem is, or the issue is global. You've got to make it manageable. And you really have a tiger by the tail. My question is, over the course of the 21st century so far, would you say that the subset from your study, that the subset of folks that are concerned about limiting reproduction theirs for the world's sake has shifted at all from I don't think it's a responsible decision to have kids because the world is so bad or the climate is so icky, to more if I bring a child into the world, what will that child experience? Do you see the distinction that I'm making? Mm-hmm. I would hypothesize that you probably would be witnessing some kind of shift in the databases that you're working with, but I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, this is very much hardly a database, the database of me, but just the conversations I hear and like among students, for example, is very focused. And I'm going to use my little nephews and niece as case studies. They're bad, poor children, but plan to ask them about this too. But I think they're more afraid of me than my students, but that's a whole other issue. But my students will often talk about it from that perspective, that they're not really attuned to, I mean, this is again, anecdotal, like less attuned to the emissions aspect. Like I actually don't hear that come up. And when I've brought it up, they're sort of like, oh, but maybe again, small sample set here, but they're much more focused on the world that is to come for themselves. I mean, like, I think a big thing I didn't talk about here is the adaptation question or the resilience question. If you are responsible for yourself or maybe one person in your family, you can be more responsive than if you are responsible for yourself and 5 other people. And this is something that comes up a lot as well in the sort of global conversation about family planning and fertility rate. They're not these folks in lower middle income countries are not contributing to emissions as much. A lot of it is about opportunities for women and what their lives will offer through family planning and education and, entering the workforce. What was I saying? Oh, it's much more about like resilience, like how many people might you have to relocate in the event of a disaster or a loss of income from a farm or whatever your livelihood is. It's just easier to respond with 2 people perhaps than 5, let's say. So I think, the world to be is often a big consideration in my context of a university, but also thinking about these programs or these proposals for lower income countries of just like, it might be easier to manage what's to come if your family is also smaller.
Well, maybe I will take the prerogative of asking our final question tonight, Heather. I'm curious, at what point in this project Roe versus Wade was overturned and how that has shaped all of the questions that you are thinking about, and if you've noticed any change in climate discourse in the US, like post-Roe.
Yeah. So, wow, it's funny. I haven't thought about the change. Well, I would say so for example, like the headlines I showed about access to abortion during hurricanes, there has been a lot of attention to how curtailing people's options about their family size and reproduction is just going to put greater strain in these other circumstances. So, yeah, but it's happened so recently that people are talking about it more as just like, what are the ramifications of this? And less like, well, we actually have looked at this, or people writing about their experience of it. So I think that'll be a big, there will be a next hurricane, right, in the US, and it'll be most likely in the South where there will not be many options. So like, I think we'll start to see even more of that conversation. One of the ways it's affected the project is I talk about those aspects of my personal life a lot more too. But really, I just got very depressed, like a lot of people, in that moment. And I thought working on this project is not like, is it helping me get through this time or not? And I live in Texas, UT Austin. It's rough. It's rough down there, folks. And it's just like living, I guess the one thing I will say is like, so certainly Dobbs was a blow, a smack in the face. But when you live in Texas, like we've been living with it for years, it had already dwindled to nothing. Like access was pretty much nothing. And also living in a state of climate inaction, and it's really hard is what I would say. Yeah. And so I haven't quite, there's obvious like red state stuff to think about those two things together, but thinking about them together in that particular context in the wake of Dobbs, I haven't, figured it out, except I get emotional about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had not thought about a similar map between the next hurricane and lack of access.
Yeah.
So that's
and obviously
important.
There are things besides hurricanes, but those are obviously incredibly disruptive to infrastructure and living in your home for a long time afterward, and displacement and all of that. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Yes. Well, on that note, we are going to give Heather a huge round of applause, and thanks for joining us tonight.